In preparing to teach on Genesis 6 and 7, the flood account, I decided to call up my good friend Dr. Ken Turner, who's a professor of Old Testament and biblical languages at Toccoa Falls College in Georgia. He specializes in Hebrew hermeneutics. He's written several books, including a commentary on Habakkuk. More recently, he's co-authored a book called The Manifold Beauty of Genesis 1. He's very well respected in his field. I trust him. He is just an incredible human being. But I've got some questions about this flood account. Join me in the conversation that I had with Dr. Turner. As I'm reading the account, well, I have lots of questions. And so I'm doing my research and reading things, but there is so much information that's out there. I thought this will be a lot more fun if I just phone a friend who happens to be a scholar and well versed in the original language and the context. So the main thing I want to get at really is the fact that there is an argument on whether or not the flood was local or global, and covering all the earth or just covering an area of the earth. I'm wondering from your perspective, why is this a debate to begin with? Is it because of like science and religion? I know there's a debate from Christians and non-Christians, but there's also a debate from within Christians and other Christians. So how did the debate even arise? Why?
Yeah, I'll try to be big picture and as quick as possible. I mean, this is the problem doing something on YouTube in a short. I mean, and you're talking to somebody who does this for a living. You can never cover all the bases and go into all the details. Um, but it's interesting on those questions of science and faith, because on one hand, the types of questions that we're asking have been around before the rise of modern science. You can go back to early Jewish and Christian exegesis, interpretation, philosophizing, and sometimes I read those and I'm like, those sound like modern questions, but they're actually wrestling with it. But on the other hand, we know that as you can't, the science part can't just be completely ignored because we learned things about the world, over the last 2,000 years. What they were debating in 400 AD is quite different than 1600 and quite different than 2026. However, it's not simple. I guess that's always going to be the answer. It's never as simple because you are dealing with biblical theological issues, just the text. And it's amazing how many people are in this conversation in my discipline that don't care or know about the science at all. And they are wrestling. So there's a whole group of people who have disagreements about how to read certain texts and how to read the overall beginning 11 chapters of Genesis that don't even consider the science. Then you add the science layer in, and that becomes another quagmire. And so part of it is just it is complicated. It does have certain layers in the history of interpretation. Um, and then we get into modern controversies about the truthfulness of the Bible. We have conservative versus liberal scholars on that kind of big theological agenda. Um, and then I'm going to add to that, and I want to be charitable here, but there are certain voices and ministries that really push hard. They have raised these discussions, which were usually in-house discussions between good and godly people who sometimes had to agree to disagree. But there have been several in the last, I'd say, probably 30, 40, up to 50 years that have really pressed issues like this, that you have to have a specific conclusion on these specific questions, or you have abandoned the faith, or at least you're in danger. And so they've elevated um, that issue really to a point that wasn't the normal kind of temperature of Christian discussions before. So, combination of factors why we're having the debate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's helpful in one way. It's helpful that there's that there's a lot going on here. Okay, let me get down to your area of expertise really is the biblical language and the context. You are an Old Testament scholar. So when it comes to like the reading the text, does the Bible require that we hold to a global flood? At my reading of it, right, that's what I would assume the way that the language works, because when I read it, there's a universal type of language, right? Talking about the destruction of every living thing and the waters rising high above the earth and covering the highest mountains, and then all flesh that moved on the earth died. Those sorts of things. So does the biblical text demand that interpretation?
I'm going to play devil's advocate because you have postured it a couple ways that are interesting that come with assumptions.
Okay.
You've decided it is an either local or global, which reduces the options to two, and it's more complicated because um, you could have global and non-global, I guess. And the non-global, there's several options.
Okay.
Local versus larger region, and then you have to add in, are we dealing with humanity? Is humanity spread out over the globe or is on a certain piece of land? On the other end, you could even deal with the whole cosmos. There have been people who thought the flood had to cover the whole universe. So that's not a common, but it is there in the history. So there's lots of options there. I'm going to keep it to global versus non-global for simplicity. Just know it's always more complex. But the other thing is your use of the word globe is an assumption, right? And you are thinking when you hear the word Earth, we all do this. We think about this spheroid. And yet when you go back to the ancient world, that's not what they were thinking. They had no conception of a globe. It doesn't mean it doesn't have something to say to that, but we are bringing in something of an anachronism to address that issue. So just that's part of it. We're bringing in baggage from our modern era. And not necessarily wrong. We just need to be aware of it. So yeah, here's the problem. You're asking a kind of a specific question about texts and phrases, and that's helpful because you do have phrases like under the whole heaven, all of the earth. Um, and I'll deal with that first, but then I'm going to get into what I think is more important in terms of how to settle this. So let's just take just as an example, because we can't cover everything. All the earth, kol haaretz is the Hebrew. So you have two words, kol meaning all or every, and then eretz um, can mean earth. It can also mean land or country or ground. So you have flexib and the word all, and anybody would recognize this. All doesn't always mean all. So you've got two words that each have to be interpreted within the specific context. And it's not hard to do a word search and find that even the whole phrase, all the earth, doesn't always mean everything, everywhere, all the time.
I think
I mean, the
isn't that
classic
same
example
phrase? I was
what's
gonna
that?
say you might be going there. That same phrase used like when all the earth comes to Egypt
To
during the
Egypt.
famine.
Yeah,
When
Genesis 41 during the famine, exact same phrase, kol haaretz. Now, nobody in their right mind thinks people were traveling around the globe and um, it would have been the known region. And even there, do you think every single individual traveled? So that's a clear example that we just instinctively know both the word all and both the word earth shouldn't be maximalized, right? We just and I think of a New Testament example in Romans 1. Paul says, I thank God that your faith is known throughout the whole world. Well, I don't think every individual on the globe has known of the Romans faith, right? And so we have to allow for the possibility of a figure of speech. However, it could be more, I hate the word literal, but more literal, more, so you have to judge it on a case by case basis. So just on that, some have interpreted the edits there, the earth, as being a smaller region, the Mesopotamian plain. Basically, you could say the known world, that the authors didn't think or care or know about anything beyond. Even the New Testament, Paul wants to take the gospel to Spain because that's basically the edge of the earth for them. And so then you'd have to wrestle with what do you do as we find evidence of people being in other places and other lands. But you could easily see how somebody might conclude that the author's attention is speaking about this region. Um, and that is very possible. However, just to play devil's advocate with myself, it's it's not a phrase here or there. You mentioned several of them. When you read through the flood story, I think you're correct to see a kind of totalizing universal feel. So then the question comes down to a larger issue of, I mean, interpretation about authorial intent. What is the author intending to do? And then you have to go about all the different ways of knowing that. We can't just read in our English Bibles, bring in our assumptions, and we have lots of presuppositions because things we were taught in Sunday school, church, homeschool for my family, right? There's a lot of things we've been taught, and it may or may not be that simple. And we have to ask, and this is where we have to go in the bigger picture of uh, Genesis 1 to 11 is of a different sort. And everyone agrees with this. Um, and so when he asks questions of genre, which is to me is the absolute most important question, what type of literature is this? And how does it relate to what we think of when we hear the word history or historicity? And that's another area where we're overly simplistic. Um, we sometimes bring modern assumptions about how history writing should be done. Um, and the fact is, and of course we can't demonstrate it here today, but the fact is, if you drill into the details, everybody's going to be coming up with tensions, seeming contradictions, not just in Genesis, but throughout anything that we would consider historical. So we have to allow even that. My starting point is it is history, and at least at the level of we're talking about real people and real events in a real past. But it doesn't mean that the precision, um, that all the details would be the same way we might write a modern kind of journalistic account. We have to be open because there are different genres. And this is where the discussion has been for a long time, is that the genre of Genesis 1 to 11 has been debated at being more and more literalistic versus a kind of an imaginative, creative retelling of of real events in a real past. I'm not interested in somebody who just wants to think it's all, complete make believe. Um, and that's where it gets tough because just to bring it back kind of small picture, yes, you can read those chapters and there is an impression of totality universalism. And maybe that's the way we should read it. But there are other things in the text of Genesis 1 to 11, that push against that. That if you were to read every single text in that literalistic fashion, you would end up with contradictions. And and that's where, for me as an interpreter, I'm trying to figure out what's the best kind of solution or answer that solves. It's kind of like a scientific theory or scientific model. What can account for the most data uh, in an explanatory way and have the least amount of problems? But there's going to be problems with every model, every way you put it up.
Can
So I
you
have a conclusion on that tentatively, but I totally understand why somebody dots their I's, crosses their T's, connects the dots, and land in a different place. And I don't accuse them of being unspiritual or anti-intellectual or right. It's not an attack on their motive because they come to a conclusion differently than me.
Okay, two questions come from that then. First of all, can you give me some examples of what do you mean by there's contradictions that would arise if you read it in that straightforward fashion?
So the flood account, you have to get really into the details, and many people have done those studies. And I mean, this is why even the old critical scholars actually have two different sources. They think that the flood account has two different sources that were just kind of smushed together. Now, I don't hold that, but it is because there's evidence in the text, the number of days that things were left. I don't have a text off the top of my head, but let me give you maybe a simpler example, not related to flood specifically, but Genesis. I think this is one where people might just pick up their Bibles and see. You have a sequence of events in Genesis 1 for the creation of the world, and you go to Genesis 2, and it's a different sequence. And you got other particularities in terms of, are we talking about the same account of creation, or with these subsequent accounts, is one more literal than the other, or are we telescoping back on one day or certain set of days? And then you've got all kinds of detailed questions about how can Adam say at last, if it's only been a few hours. So these are just normal things, and that's off the top of my head just an example where, and then you just even have phrases about, God being painted in human-like form. I mean, those again, you can't press the literality with all of this. What does it mean to have a day without there being, sun, moon, and stars, and these kind of things? These go way back, these kind of observations. And they're not as fun with the flood account, but there are those details when you actually look at the numbers, the amount of days something takes, um, uh, even how long a month is. It gets tricky, but it does take looking at the actual details to
Okay.
understand that.
Okay. Well, yeah. So that's helpful. When it comes to this flood account and that universal feel that you get from the language, I see that okay, well, it doesn't demand that the entire Earth, the way that we think about the Earth, the globe, be covered in water. What does it demand? It seems
Yeah,
like there is a communication of judgment, right? Of mankind and evil being wiped out, almost a decreation, a restarting kind of thing.
yeah,
So what is the main thrust that is obviously from your expertise being communicated through this flood account?
yeah. Let me back up
Okay.
and here I guess I'll lay my cards on the table. Um, I don't find the argument that Earth simply means land, and therefore you can limit the scope, the best answer. It is a possible answer. I think we should take the universal language seriously, but then we have to ask, does this mean this literally happened this way? That's possible. Um, or is there evidence in the text that within the genre we are dealing with hyperbole, exaggerated language for theological purposes? And again, I can't take a lot more time to argue it, but to me, that feels like a more right direction, um, especially if we're interested in possible non-global. I'm still open to it being the whole globe. I've got to deal with the science and I'm aware of the science. I have a science undergrad and I don't think Christians should ignore it. Um, but if somebody just was committed to it, that's fine. But yes, and that what you're asking is always my bigger question. I often tell my students I want to separate what I call the biblical theological question, which is what is the truth, right? And we have that debate. Um, and then the pastoral question, right? How are we going to handle when brothers and sisters disagree? And to me, that's a more important, but sometimes more difficult question. Where to draw those lines of fellowship? Um, and my basic instinct is to stand back and say, okay, let's talk about the theology. We can disagree what exactly happened if we get in a time machine and went back and hit record, right? But the text really isn't written to prove something that happened in history. It is assuming that a flood happened. How do we
Mhm.
know that? Because every culture around Israel also, or in that region, also assumed a flood because we've got multiple flood stories. So I think we have to take this as Israel's retelling of an event that everybody agrees happened, but telling it as a theological treatise. And so there's an underlying polemic against the other nations and their gods. And so that would be what I would press. Let's look at the theology and let's agree on that. And then, have a cup of coffee and argue about the other things. That's kind of my posture on these kind of things. So the theology is, you had mentioned it. Obviously, we could look at the obvious thing that this is God's judgment on sinful humanity, and then But it doesn't finish there, right? Because God likes to put himself between a rock and a hard place. He said he must judge sin, and yet he has made promises. He has made a promise back in the garden that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. Um, so he's put himself in a tough spot because yes, you can wipe out humanity through a flood, but to keep that promise, he needs to preserve something of the human race. And yet, what does Noah take on with him? A few of his family, a bunch of animals, and the sin nature. And so the theology of the story, yes, it is to show going from creation to uncreation to recreation. By the way, since creation was of the whole universe, that's why some have tried to say the flood must be the cover the whole universe, because that's the only way that totally makes that happen. So there's a theological rationale for that. Um, so yeah, this is a do-over and to show God's grace and his commitment to his own promises. The central verse, you can actually arrange the whole flood story in kind of a big chiasm. And the central verse is chapter 8, verse 1, where it says, God
And a
remembered Noah.
chiasm was where it builds to a climax and then goes
Yeah.
back down, right? That's
If you think about a letter X sideways, that's right. The center, the very center is the climax of it.
okay.
And then yeah, all the pieces around it. The last part, the first and last match, the second and second to last match in terms of themes. There's a very normal way of structuring text in the ancient world. Um, and so this is about God's grace. Noah found grace, not favor. I don't like that translation. It's grace. He found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And it's also a way for God to keep himself committed to his promises that he's already given, and he continues to add more promises. That's the big picture. And I think of the flood when you think about the covenants, and I would hold to what's called the creation covenant, and God making promises to humanity. He rebooted this covenant. The covenant with Noah is kind of a, a, a reboot of the creation covenant. You can see that, right, you got him as the headwaters of all human beings. You've got a repeat of the creation mandate to be fruitful and multiply. So reboot. Um, but the answer for the Old Testament, how is God going to be able to keep his word and ultimately find the seed of the woman and crush the head of the serpent? It's not the flood. And so in some ways, I think of the flood as, from a literary standpoint, as a foil. And a foil simply means um, you give basically the wrong answer to be the contrast to the right answer. It's kind of like when King Saul was made king because that's what the people wanted. Well, he was a foil because God had David in mind from the beginning. So you get to see the bad, right, the opposite, and then it helps clarify. And surprisingly, in Genesis, the answer is Abraham and the
Mhm.
covenant that will come through him with that climactic verse in Genesis 12:3, through you all the families of earth shall be blessed, where it harkens back to Genesis 3:15. So in between Genesis 3 and Genesis 12, we have the story of the flood um, that teaches lots of things, but one thing it teaches it's not the answer to how God's going to keep his covenant promises because sin continues on the earth. And so just wiping everybody out can't be God's answer. So that's from
Mhm.
a literary perspective, I think. So judgments, creation, uncreation, recreation, and then thinking about this kind of progress of God's redemption. I think if we're all celebrating that and focusing on that, I think we can agree to disagree. As long, listen, I think everyone needs to check their motive, their heart. It is possible to give undue um, allegiance to scientific conclusions. I think Christians must, because we have this category in theology called general revelation. We must care about the evidence that's in God's world. Um, and if that is true revelation of God, then it is true. That
Mhm.
does not mean that Christians are beholden to have to agree with the latest scientific theory. And I love science. And so I think scientific theories are important, but it doesn't mean that, right? I will tell my students all the time, if you really think after doing all the discussion, investigation, listening to the other sides, and you think the Lord's teaching you something like a global flood, I say you believe the Bible. But hopefully in that process of research, you can see just maybe why somebody with pure motives might come to a different conclusion, or maybe sit in kind of agnostic, I'm not sure what to do with all this data.
Hmm.
I, I think what's out of bounds is saying, just accusing people of motive, saying this is such an important issue, we can't fellowship together, right? That kind of hardline stance. Um, I certainly don't think we should just let science control our interpretation. Though sometimes you find things in nature, it makes you go rethink and reinvestigate, and maybe you come to the same conclusion. Maybe you're now open to more options. Um, I also don't like the posture. Well, it's too complicated. People disagree. Let's not care about it. It's okay to say I don't know when you've done your homework. You've gone through the blood, sweat, and tears, and you still don't know. I also don't think it's helpful. Let's say somebody is really convinced of a global flood. Again, I work with lots of people. Some of my favorite people are there. I'm not as convinced. I'm open. I'm open. But what I don't like is when some of these people enter the science realm and try to act like the science obviously proves a global flood. That is not true. They should at least recognize that there are lots of questions and concerns, and even Christians with their own camp, even in the last 40, 50 years, have changed their view on lots of things. Um, you asked about an example just earlier, maybe this kind of an example. What do you do with this rakia, this firmament, this in Genesis 1 that it used to be thought that there was this solid kind of sky that was opened up during the floods. And you still see that in literature sometimes coming from conservative Christians. But the people who are leading that group actually don't believe that anymore. And so sometimes it takes a generation, even within somebody's own camp, to realize, oh, the experts that we trust and follow actually don't believe this anymore. Our own position can be outdated. So that's
Hmm.
another issue.
Yeah, this
Sorry, I've
is
been in the homeschool world, and so I've seen that that happen a lot.
yeah, yeah. Well, if that's there, then it gives some explanation to
Right.
some of the things we might read at face value, which brings me to my last real question on this topic anyway, and that is why can't we just read the Bible at face value? And I know you've been getting at all of this, but maybe you can sum it up because I'm thinking more broadly, and you brought up some examples even with like the age of the earth and those days of creation. If it's God's word, right? If it's inerrant God's word, then why can't we just read it? Didn't God have us in mind? Aren't we part of the receiving audience? Why do we have to do this work to go back? And the reason I bring this up is because often this is the charge, right? If you don't agree with this particular position, then you're not believing God's word. So it comes down to something really important for some people, a foundational issue, an essential doctrine, not this is a tertiary thing, agree to disagree. For some people, this comes down to biblical inerrancy, whether or not this is
Yeah.
God's word. So maybe just speak to that for a minute.
Yeah. When somebody says, what's the plain meaning? My first response is plain to whom? Uh, I mean, the Catholics say this is my body, right? Uh, and so we should take Jesus literally there. There's all kinds of horrors, like people supporting slavery in the past. They could say just that's the plain meaning of these texts. And so we have to be careful because that posture, that kind of approach has done great damage. Um, Even in this realm, right? The fact that we all agree on and don't even think about a globe. Well, it took the church 200 years to affirm that because they were reading other passages that supported the earth being the center of the universe, the earth being flat, right? And so, of course, we've got all these flat earthers running around today that are drumming up the same thing. So the idea of what the plain meaning is, there's too much historical evidence that that hasn't solved the issue and it's created a lot of damage. Of course, that's often coming from people who are reading their English translations. Translations are interpretations. English is not Hebrew. On its all, and it primarily comes from people who don't realize the world that the Bible came out of.
Mhm.
As John Walton has famously said, the Bible was written for us, but not to us. And our access to God's revelation in Scripture comes through human authors who had human audiences from a world that's often quite foreign to us.
Hmm.
And so this is where the investigation of ancient Near Eastern world, ancient Near Eastern literature, perspectives, what do they think the world is? Once you realize that background, you could even ask your same question, you'll have a different answer. The plain meaning. Well, it depends on what you're bringing to the table in terms of background.
Yeah.
And of course,
Yeah.
the more investigation you go, you realize it's always much more complex.
Hmm.
So,
That's so good. I think so many people uh, just kind of assume this classical doctrine of revelation of inerrancy. They just don't realize that that doctrine, historically speaking, is applied to the autographs, not to our translations. And if we keep that in mind, it's to the autographs, then we have to do exactly what you said. Well, then we have to understand the original author to the original audience in the original language. That actually requires some work rather than us reading into the text from our perspective.
yeah, and I won't get on a rabbit trail. For the language of autographs makes sense in the New Testament, it doesn't make as much
Right,
sense in the
because we
Old
don't have,
Testament
there's not an original written
because
down
you
sort
have
of thing.
layers of
Yes.
editing. So, yeah, what is the auto? It's not like, Paul is sitting in prison writing a letter to the Philippians. Well, there was an autograph, but Old
Hmm.
Testament texts are different. But that's beside all it does, it gets more complicated. But you're right. And it's interesting that if you read a very, very conservative definition of inerrancy, the Chicago Statement, which is the background of the Evangelical Theological Society. So these are conservative people. Inerrancy can be defined different ways, but
Hmm.
one of the most conservative definitions, when you read through the articles, talks a lot about we need to pay attention to genre and hyperbole and figures of speech and expectations of precision and um yeah, it's very careful, and that's one of the most conservative statements and the most popular statements. So I guess that would be another good thing. Is somebody said, "Why can't I just read?" Well, these are the people who are very conservative, teaching in the Bible seminaries and colleges, and this is what they have said for the last however long it's been around since I guess what was it, 70? I forget exactly the date, but and it's interesting when you use Evangelical Theological Society (ETS) as an example, that if you look both at the framers of that statement um, and the current membership, these are not issues that come up for division. We are not every year voting out people who hold to a local flood or an old earth. Though there's plenty of young earth people and global flood advocates there. And so, just sociologically, those who use these terms and kind of the experts, at least in North America, who talk about inerrancy, that they have decided collectively this is not. Now, they may be part of churches or denominations or schools that might require something, but they do see a level of fellowship because we know that there's a larger, right? We have a larger agenda and mission, and we don't want this to be distracting.
Yeah. So good. Thank you, Ken, for your expertise on this.
Yeah,
Uh, I do have a few other questions that are
sure.
somewhat related as we've been going through Genesis. These questions have been coming up in our small groups, and and they're just kind of fun. And I know I could be opening up such a big door with what I'm about to ask you, but just maybe to get your direction on this. Okay, here's the first one: the Nephilim. What just
Yeah.
like what is your take? Um, it seems to be this is the conclusion just kind of at our church where we've come to these sons of God. The two interpretations. These are human, just normal, descendants versus that are not the daughters of Eve, but that sons of God language seem to imply spiritual beings are involved. All right, so was there a real true mixing of the two, or were these spiritual beings somehow just really influencing? Like, just what's your take on the Nephilim, and how should we even think about it?
Yeah, there's actually about five views, but
Okay.
but
Okay.
I would say that yeah, I mean this is a fun discussion that doesn't really matter in the end. We know that I mean it has implications, but it's not the biggest deal. Should never divide over this issue. Um, what we do know in the text that this is a forerunner for the flood, and so this is at least one of the reasons that brought on the flood. Um, and so yes, I think just my own opinion, I think the least likely is that we're simply dealing with two different human lineages, right from Cain and Seth. Uh, there are people who good people, good scholars who hold that, but I think it's the least likely. Um, and it's the latest view. I mean, I prefer the what you might call the angelic view. If you think about these sons of God as being rebel angels, what we would, I don't really want to use the word demon because that's a little out of place, but yeah, let's just say fallen angels.
Hmm.
Um,
And when you're saying angels, we have talked about this a little bit. You're just referring to spiritual beings, right?
yeah,
Not the
spiritual
not
beings
messenger
who
role of a spiritual being.
yeah, I'm using angel in the more popular sense.
Right.
I'd
Right.
get
Right.
more
Right.
technical because the Old Testament does use angel the way we do, but I'm kind of using the Christianese
Okay.
language of divine or semi-divine beings, right, whose natural habitat is up in heaven, but can engage this world, take on human form, and have sex with human women, and so there'd be this crossing over and this unlawful mixing that seems to be um I think the more popular is that the humans are participating in this. And so the Nephilim would be the offspring of this forbidden union of the divine and human. And these are the giants that we also see these giants later roaming around in Canaan. So there's a whole question, how to get the Nephilim
Hmm.
there. But that
Hmm.
is the oldest Jewish view. It is the consistent, even though there's not a lot of text, that everywhere else sons of God in the plural is used. Uh, and this it still makes a lot of sense if you can get past the weirdness of it. There's problems and questions. There's kind of a hybrid position too, though. Son of God, singular, is often used as a title for the king. And so it is possible that we're talking about, I'm going to use the word even though it's anachronistic, demon possessed kings who have these harems. And there you have kind of a mixing, right? Yes, they might be the sons of God could be humans, but they are being influenced by the demonic, and so you still have that forbidden mixing. That would be a hybrid position that I'd be open to. That still matches the ancient Eastern data, but technically the text does not say the Nephilim are the byproducts of the sexual union, and so that has to be an assumption in the text. It just simply says you have the sexual activity in verse 2, and verse 4 it just says the Nephilim. And
Mm.
so there are those who separate those out because it's interesting. Probably the biggest reason I hold to the angelic view is the New Testament. Both Peter and Jude talk about sinning angels, and then they mention the flood, and this is the only possible passage they could be thinking about. But they don't mention Nephilim. It's just about the sons of God. So
Hmm.
some I think it's more likely that we're dealing with the byproducts, but um, just letting you know, it's a little tricky when you actually stare at the actual text.
Okay, well, that's helpful to even think about it in these right ways and right categories. And something that just came up that you said that the human women were participating in this. Like this is also indicating a sinful activity of humans. This is not necessarily from the text. You don't see that the these angelic beings, these spiritual beings, are raping human women and producing offspring. Is that
I
right?
mean, you could read it that way. But
Okay.
the reason I'm assuming or thinking it's more likely that there's human participation is because this is a prelude to the flood, and God goes specifically at human beings.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I
Okay.
guess you can envision maybe this is their fathers involved, but it would be weird to have these innocent human women, and then right away, a few verses later, God is judging humans for all the wickedness on the earth. So it seems again, I'm connecting dots that aren't explicitly there,
Okay.
but that seems to be more natural. Because one of the objections to the angelic view is then, why are we dealing with judgment on humans when we just had these angels? Was well, they've infected the human race, and humans have participated in it.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. When the Nephilim do show up later, when these giants show up later, do you think the same thing has happened after the flood? Like, how are they still there after the flood? There's probably a few views on that.
One
Could you?
option is that God allowed this sinful mixing to happen again. Another option is they survived the flood. That's one argument people have made for a less than global flood, that they hid away on mountains. There's an old Jewish, my favorite one is this is an old Jewish position that one of the Nephilim hid on the ark, like Jack on the Titanic. And so, or other people have said that one of the wives of Noah's sons was had this Nephilim blood in them. The point is we don't know. I mean,
Hmm.
I guess another option is that when the spies said Nephilim, that it just reminded them of this story that had been told, but that doesn't, it seems to say it too much. It seems to actually say, of course, that would be part of my theological argument why God went in and wiped out the Canaanites is because of these Nephilim. So I don't know the answer. The text doesn't say. It's one of those kind of
And I
disconnects.
guess
And
it also could be a reference back to kind of like the Nephilim of old. We have kings and people who are spiritually possessed or corrupted,
yeah,
influenced, right? Okay.
yeah.
All right. All right.
So,
One last question that two of the young men in our community group brought up last night that I said, I'll just ask Dr. Turner when I talk to him tomorrow. I have maybe some ideas. Going back to the beginning. Uh, Here's the question. This my son actually asked this question, and since he knows you, I said, okay, I'll ask him, see what he says. Uh, Adam and Eve, they reproduced, they had babies. Does this mean their children are incestual? Are they committing incest? Are they reproducing with one another? And connected to that, another young man in the group, it's like, well, when we see Cain and Abel, Cain is afraid of other people. Who are these other people? Are they his brothers and sisters? What are the various options that answer these questions?
all right. So going back to the plain reading of the text, we have a problem here because Genesis 2 through 4 is one unit. We have that phrasing, the Toledot, these are the generations of. That's how Genesis connects the
And you
units.
said back to the plain reading from our position, right?
Right. But I'm saying even there, we're going to be in conflict because when I read Genesis 2 and 3, I don't envision anything beyond God, Adam, and Eve, and then the cherubim, right? And a snake. Now, we assume that there's other animals because it was said that, but you certainly don't imagine other human beings, right? I guess somebody could argue that, but that's not the plain meaning. So, one plain meaning says we have this one couple, and then you jump to Genesis 4, and I would say the plain meaning suggests a completely different reading because you've got people enough to build a city. Where did he get his wife from? Enough people that they're doing divisions of labor. Um, you've got Cain killing Abel in the field. Why? That's so it can't be heard by people in the city. So I have a list of 7 things I go through that the plain meaning would suggest you got tons of people. And so this is the problem of the people outside the garden. And so there is no plain meaning in that you can just read through chapters 2 to 4. And so this is where everybody has to come up with their options. Now, the traditional approach is to take what they see as the plain meaning of Genesis 2 and 3 and then try to create scenarios, um, like a lot of it's there is the issue of incest, but there's also the issue of just multiplying numbers. You don't get the sense that the women in Genesis 4 have these super miraculous wombs that are producing 8 and 10 kids at a time. It reads like it's
Right.
normal birth.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to do the math and figure out how do we get all that. So you could force it, but I would just say that's not natural reading. Maybe it's the right answer. And then you have to deal with the moral issue of incest. And some would just say, yeah, it wasn't a problem until later. And others are saying, no, I'm not ready for that. So another option is that however he did it, that God had created these other people that were outside the garden. So as Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, they interacted with them and mated with them. And somehow, whatever we think of the transfer of sin from Adam, um, not just happens vertically through the generations, but could have infected. And then if you want to get into the whole evolution question, people will say, well, maybe these are hominids. And then once Adam, right, that just adds layers to it. But you don't even have to go there. And again, this is a great example that before modern science, the text is raising really difficult questions. They're often called pre-Adamites or co-Adamites in the research. And neither of these options, if I could be simplistic, is a plain reading of the text. And so people are going to favor certain pieces of evidence over others, right? And again, this is why we have different models. What do you think deals with the most data in a helpful way with the least problems remaining? And we may disagree on that, putting the big picture together. And then you can bring in New Testament text and all of that. So, but the text itself is a conundrum. And this is way before modern science. We're talking about early Jewish interpretation, Christian wrestling with these things. Even the early church fathers. We're all over the map on this.
All right. Well, look, with so many questions that arise from this would have been maybe from ancient people, but certainly before our time and definitely our time. Like, so how can we even trust the Bible here and what it's communicating?
Oh, I guess I'm weird because I think it makes me trust it more. I
Tell
think
me
if
more.
if we had a supposed revealed text, religious text that totally made sense to me, and a God who totally made sense, it'd be a figment of our imagination. Uh, the Bible as we have it is not the book you would write if you're making up a religion. So to me, the difficulties and to have a God who I don't always understand or even things he does that I even like kind of attracts me to him. Maybe this is my weird personality. It's like, oh, if there is a God, if God is real, there's going to be things I don't understand, and there's going to be things that I don't track with. But we've talked about this before on the Canaanite issue. But I think about Abraham with Sodom and Gomorrah. I think about Peter, the feeding of the idea of eating my body and drinking my blood. That those guys did not understand everything God was doing in those cases, and yet there was something about the relationship, their trust in God, that kept them hanging on. And that's what I do when I come across this. So, and if God is God, He can do what He wants. And like I said, this probably made more sense to the original audience, and we're not them. So, yeah, I could see why that question would bother people. It just has not been a personal bother of mine. It makes me excited to go study, to go research, and it keeps me coming back to the big picture. The Bible is clear on who God is, what He expects of us. This overarching plan of redemption is there, and and of course Jesus brings light to all of it. And if we can agree
You
on
would,
that, I'm good with
yeah,
going through the
yeah.
details and figuring it out.
And you would say from the very beginning, there are very plain and clear truths that are being communicated that
Absolutely.
you cannot miss. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Even if
God
there's
is the
questions
creator.
about,
He's
yeah.
the judge. He's the redeemer. We're sinful. um, Yeah, and our sinfulness, no matter what century, what millennium, what culture, it looks a lot very similar. And so what we have in the Old Testament is a lot of stories showing our sinfulness because we share in their sinfulness. But we have the same God who shows the same grace. And that's what's exciting about these stories.
Very cool. Dr. Turner, thank you for your time, for your expertise. This was a great conversation, enlightening, comforting, and you have a way of pointing people to the main thing that ultimately climaxes in Jesus. That's thank you that for that.
Great. I hope it helps.
Yeah, totally.